Do you remember that terrible case of the 2-year-old toddler who died after prolonged exposure to mould in a social home in Rochdale? His name was Awaab Ishak, died in 2020. I think everyone was really shocked that anyone should have to live in circumstances where there is more or less permanent mould on the walls, and the landlord, it doesn't really matter whether it's a housing association, a local council property, or a private landlord, that anybody should feel that that is the right way for a family to live in, particularly with small children. It's beyond the pale, isn't it? I think it shocked the whole nation. And I pay credit to his family, who decided that no one else should have to go through what they had gone through as a family, and they campaigned to change the law. And that law has come into force today. So it just shows that something can be achieved when you launch a campaign to right a wrong. Now, this new law forces landlords to fix dangerous damp and mould issues. And it's been named after Awaab Ishak. Awaab's law, it's been called. Under this law, landlords will now have to investigate hazardous living conditions within a set period of time, or face court action or compensation orders. Now, in England, these rules come into force in England, and a UK-wide survey found that 23% of those who said they had issues such as damp, mould or condensation in their homes were social renters, while 21% were in private rented accommodation. Now, some 3,982 adults were surveyed by Census-wide earlier this month for the Health Equals campaign, which claims lives are being cut short across the UK, with damp, cold and mould in people's homes being part of the problem. So campaigners are calling for new, tougher requirements for social landlords to act more quickly on issues to be applied urgently to the private rented sector. Now, the government's committed to extending Awaab's law to this sector through the Renters' Rights Bill, which is currently awaiting royal assent. But no firm time frame has been given. Well, that doesn't make sense, because if the bill's awaiting royal assent, it is unamendable. So I think there's a bit of forked tongues being used there. Now, this research by Health Equals also found people from the lowest income households were almost twice as likely to live in homes with issues like damp or mould than the higher income households, 21% compared with 12%. So my question to you is this: what is the condition of social housing in this country, whether it's run by the public sector or whether it's run by the private sector? If you are in a home that has got mould and damp or permanent condensation, you frankly probably don't really care the status of your landlord. You just want it fixed, and fixed quickly, particularly if that home is inhabited by young children or indeed the elderly. So what's been your experience when you've asked your landlord, as I say, whether it's a local council, a housing association, or indeed a private sector landlord, when you've asked your landlord to fix it, what's happened? And do you have any confidence that this law is actually going to make it easier for you to get the work done? 0345 6060 973. Well, earlier this evening, my colleague Andrew Marr spoke with Awaab Ishak's father, Faisal Abdullah, and he gave us an insight into what kinds of conditions the family were having to live through.
Yeah, it was a lot of mold in the kitchen and the bathroom as well, most likely in the bathroom and the living room, and the cupboards as well. I was having a lot of mold, and the smell is disgraceful and disgusting. Was a lot of strong smell is coming from the house.
Let's talk to Suzanne Muna, who's Secretary of the Social Housing Action Campaign. Suzanne, very good evening to you. What do you think the impact of this new law is actually going to mean for tenants in the situation that that family found themselves in?
Yeah, well, I wish we could have any kind of confidence that this was actually going to make a difference. But at SHAC, we don't have any confidence about the impact of this law. There is already existing legislation called actually Homes Fit for Human Habitation Act, which says that homes have to be fit for human habitation. So really what this law is doing is really just building on the existing legislation. But in essence, it's a complete abdication of government responsibility, which pushes enforcement onto the individuals rather than having a proper inspectorate and enforcement system. So it doesn't close the enforcement gap. People struggle to bring a case to court, whether it's the tribunal, they struggle to get a case to the housing ombudsman, they struggle to get their cases addressed by their landlords. And this act isn't going to actually close that enforcement gap. People can't get legal aid for housing issues. And we know legal aid is under strain anyway, but even if it was properly funded, it doesn't extend to a lot of housing issues, which drives people to use what can be very exploitative, no win, no fee lawyers for disrepairs claims. I'm not saying all no win, no fee lawyers are exploitative, but certainly, it is a market that has a lot of exploitative practice in it. And there aren't any really meaningful penalties. I mean, talking about kind of small penalties for these housing associations, Clarion has an operating surplus of 232 million. L&Q, that we get a lot of complaints about in terms of disrepairs, has an operating surplus of 377 million, for example. You'd have to have really massive fines to make any difference to these organisations. And, you would then be asking, well, who is going to be penalised when these big organisations if there were big fines against them? So really, it's just left this huge gaping hole about how do people actually enforce it, and why anyway is it individuals that are being asked to enforce decent housing when these landlords are making lots of money out of people, whether they're social or whether they're private.
So what level are the fines set at?
I don't know. We haven't seen what the levels will be. But typically, for example, when the housing ombudsman awards compensation, so they can order repairs to be done, but typically when they order compensation to be paid, it is around the mark. I think their average, not that long ago, was around £260. Now, this legislation might raise that, but we can see with landlords that have these huge surpluses that know the vast majority of tenants and residents are not going to be able to get into a court. They're quite happy to take on any kind of fine or financial penalty as really just being another business expense. When you leave it to an individual level, you also exclude a whole load of people out of being able to bring a case. If English isn't your first language, if you have a learning difficulty, if you have problems, dealing with authorities, then it's going to be very, very difficult for you to bring a case against your landlord. And once again, we go back to there are much better ways. Government should not be saying this is down to the individual to enforce. Government is often paying these landlords because money is going through the benefit system. We should be making sure that at the very least what we are getting in exchange are homes that aren't going to kill people.
But the fact here is that a lot of these properties are owned by local councils or housing associations. Are you suggesting there should be some sort of new inspectorate, which would obviously then cost the taxpayer money to fund to sort of enforce any action against landlords? Because I mean, the law works normally that if you're an organisation or you're an individual, it's up to you to bring the case against the landlord. Why should the wider taxpayer have to fund that?
Well, we have inspectorates for other public services and for other services that are being delivered. Poor housing cost us huge millions and millions of pounds every year. If you look at research by Medax, for example, has done some really good research and collated a lot of information about this. The cost to the NHS is huge when you look at disrepairs, at accidents in the home that are caused by disrepairs. If you look at ill health through as with Awaab Ishak, mould and damp and very unhealthy living conditions. that cost is immediately passed on to the National Health Service, which is already overstretched. And you know, it's very expensive. It's very expensive to the taxpayer. And also, we are leaving people to live in misery, you know, in really miserable circumstances, and saying, if you want to do something about it, you're on your own. You have to do it. You won't get legal aid. Probably won't be able to get a solicitor to help you.
Well, what are housing charities for then? I mean, if they can't help people in these circumstances, what on earth is the point of them?
Which housing charities?
Well, there are all sorts of different charities. I mean, Shelter being one.
Yeah. But I mean, Shelter can't bring the sheer number of cases of damp and disrepairs and mould. And these cases go on for years and years and years, with landlords being quite comfortable, even when somebody does get to court, being quite comfortable with ignoring what the courts order in terms of getting the repairs done. So we have cases where people 2 or 3 years after having had a court ruling that said those repairs have to be done, have still not had their repairs done.
But what about the regulator of social housing? That was set up 7 years ago. It got increased powers last year. And the gov.uk website says it sets standards and carries out robust regulation focusing on driving improvement in social landlords, including local authorities, and ensures that housing associations are well governed, financially viable and offer value for money. It takes appropriate action if the outcomes of the standards are not being delivered. Well, that's exactly what you've been calling for. It already exists.
Yeah, it doesn't. They don't do inspections. There used to be an inspection regime for housing, and that was cut. You know, 20 odd years ago. That was cut away in the bonfire of the Quangos. That was taken out. So the regulator of social housing, what they do is they publish the satisfaction levels. For example, housing associations have to publish satisfaction levels with things like repairs, and those are published on their website. That came in with the recent legislation that you were talking about. And the idea is that it will name and shame the bad landlords. The bad landlords will be really embarrassed, you know, about getting, you know, very poor scores on this. Well, we've had it for a couple of years now, and we're still not seeing this driving improvement. In fact, the Housing Ombudsman is reporting record numbers of cases on a whole range of issues, including disrepairs, that people are still not getting their repairs done.
Sorry to interrupt, but part of the remit of this regulator of social housing is to take appropriate action if the outcomes of the standards are not being delivered. They set the standards, they carry out robust regulation. I mean, the way I interpret that is that they do virtually everything that you've been asking a new body to do.
No, well, they don't do inspections, and they haven't got the powers to enforce except in really, really extreme circumstances. Which are usually to do with the landlord actually struggling financially, but they don't intervene directly in the vast majority of cases. They won't intervene in a case and reach a judgment in a case. They will publish a judgment about the overall financial and governance state of the organisation. Their powers have been stripped away. You've just talked about the fact that their powers were increased, but for years beforehand, their powers were successively cut away, so that they no longer regulate, for example, the management and levels of tenant engagement, and, you know, various other areas that in the past they historically were charged with actually regulating. And it now only comes down to really governance and finances, and then they've added this little bit of extra consumer regulation on top of that. So their remit is nowhere near, and also the action that they can take, their feet.
To sum up, this piece of legislation would make no difference whatsoever.
We can't see, unless you close that enforcement gap, unless you make it easy, either make it much, much easier for people to enforce their legal rights, or government centrally take control and start holding big landlords, these big corporate landlords, whether they're private or housing association or councils, and start really holding them to account and enforcing them, instead of be holding back because they depend on them for a lot of delivery in terms of developing new housing, which makes government want to take a very hands-off approach when it comes to actually, you know, really in a powerful way, actually regulating these landlords.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Suzanne. That's Suzanne Mooner, Secretary of the of the Social Housing Action Campaign.